Welcome back, everybody. Good to see everybody here in the club. After everything that we said last week, we talked about how the sexual revolution didn't end in the 60s. This 60s personality, and I want to emphasize that personality, archetype, identity, that is the main focus here, rather than the political ramifications that usually go with it. And people can do that on their own time. But this 60s identity that persisted in the 70s and started to make its way into academia, outside the college campus and into journalism, political spaces, able to project power to people like Richard Nixon, Enoch Powell, and then skip over the 80s. And in the 90s, we start to see a new wave of this trend, because the theme for this presentation is the hippies. And I think that they help us understand American culture, not just American counterculture, but the legacy of American identity. And I also want to emphasize something that may not be totally clear, but the 90s are a continuation of the 1960s. And what do I mean by that? When we look at these two decades, what do they both share? They share sexual liberation, sex, drugs, and we also see political division, riots, racial agitation. And I think a lot of that is not seen. One decade is seemingly framed in this romantic way, and the other is seen as something went awry. There is this political diversion that must have happened, or a perversion of the movement. But I'm here to claim that I think this is the natural progression of the hyperliberal identity in the 1960s. And so if we go to our next slide, I think when people conventionally think about war, they think about men on a battlefield. This is a 20th century viewing of things, and that's something that I want to bring to people's attention. There are certainly things worth defending in the 20th century. However, I think one of the things that Murray Rothbard emphasizes is the fact that a lot of this is a crutch. We'll be sticking to the 60s as the decade to reference off of, some of the counterculture in America more specifically, but we'll also be talking about how this translated into a crutch for the remaining decades of the century. People look at foreign policy exclusively by a 20th century framework, or they look at politics through that certain framework. And the 60s are no exception to that. And so we're not talking about the Vietnam War. We're not talking about the Cold War. Those things are happening in the 60s. We're talking about a psychological war that is happening. And this is the modern way of doing it, the modern warfare, too, by the way. And so we'll get into our next slide as to how exactly that is happening. So there's this book that we really glazed over in one of our presentations in the club. And a very intelligent, dashing Irish lad by the name of Keith Woods dedicated a video to this book that people I recommend should check out. It's called Who Paid the Piper? And it goes over the people in this left, my left, some people's left, some people's rights, but nevertheless, it is talking about the Congress of Cultural Freedom. Now, there's a couple ways to describe this. We could go down some conspiratorial rabbit holes. I'm probably not going to stop you if that's your agenda, but I think that's a little too autistic, even for me. And I think I want to be respectful of the Zoomers in the audience, Zoomers in the chat, replay gang. I think that it would be a lot more appropriate to stick to the cultural dynamic, because what is the Congress of Cultural Freedom? It is a branch of the CIA, an advocacy group that was prevalent in Europe as well as domestically in the US. They were behind a lot of pop culture activism within music and also some projects. For example, Gloria Steinem was affiliated with the CIA and was one of the personalities of the second wave of feminism. Somebody like Timothy Leary, who affiliated himself and others promoted the use of LSD, who also had research programs. And so what is the point of me bringing that up? What is the takeaway? A lot of this has political implications, but I think there's also a cultural thing here too. what is happening with these CIA ops. Some people may be more familiar with MK Ultra or counterintelligence program. The takeaway for this presentation is the fact that movements, personalities, identities, cultural memories can be synthetic. There are artificial personalities, and a lot of these hippies, I think, fell victim to it. They think that a lot of their quote unquote heroes were organic, that their movements happened through grassroots activism. But what happens with a lot of the hippie identity is a lot of, and we'll get into Hunter S. Thompson, but he talks about how a lot of them became victims of the status quo because they didn't have a philosophical underpinning defending them. I think that there is potential for this to happen with Generation Z, a youth movement that can go a number of different ways. And I would like us to learn from the past. I would like us to be armed with revisionism, pre-modern views for the sake of survival, but also because I believe it is the truth. And so that is the Congress, Cultural Freedom, mainly talking about how the hippie identity cannot be as authentic as we may see it on the surface. But in our next slide, I would like to stick to some positive trajectories that we have at our disposal. So us as Zoomers, we have some advantages, but we also have disadvantages. We are born into the digital age, born into a scene of angerness and greed, dominance and persecution, but we also have the internet. And as we focused in our last speech, technology often doesn't get emphasized for its negative traits. However, kind of a different look for this speech, I think that the advantage of being born into the digital age is we're able to look back in retrospect. We don't have this filter holding us back that a lot of the boomers do who have memories of this time. I've mentioned in a separate stream about how you're often at a disadvantage when you hear about boomers talking about the 80s. Even if they have the credentials, they went to concerts, they participated in the pop culture. Similar to the hippies, a lot of those memories are distorted due to drug use and other personal handicaps, but that's just it. That is the drawback of being there when the scene is popping. I think that Zoomers can avoid a lot of those hangups. And we don't have to worry when we're looking at the 60s about the Miss Magazine writers trying to persuade the religious right to join their ranks. We don't have to worry about people like Betty Friedman who are indoctrinating certain women to have specific views on sex. And that's why last week I wanted to emphasize the fact that people like Louise Perry are on the front lines talking from a millennial perspective, understanding the dating landscape, the cultural landscape that a lot of Zoomers, I think, take for granted. And so it takes that external voice, it takes that other generation to make sense of things. However, millennials, as we've emphasized, also have some drawbacks. I think they also fall victim to the boomer truth regime, which we've talked about before, a academic agent term. And that is the fact that there are assumptions made about eras of history. There are assumptions that certain principles are worth being loyal to, and some even compromise their religious values. Some people compromise friendships and things like that for the sake of popularity, because it is the status quo. And that's what the hippies, unfortunately, fell victim to. And so millennials, I think, are kind of an extension of boomer truth. Maybe they can filter it out a little bit. We got some good ones, Gio Pennicchietti, an Italian, Hungian futurist, among others. We got some good ones, Charlemagne. But I would like to focus that we can avoid a lot of that boomer truth as Zoomers. And so I think in our next slide, one of the themes that seem to define the hippie legacy is the protest songs. Some people might have the impression that because this is part of an American culture, politics is inevitable, it's going to seep its way into the music. However, there's a specific identity latched onto the hippies, and it's this very partisan one, this activist class, which eventually escalated into bio-Leninism, professor types. And it's kind of ironic that the students would end up becoming the professors that they grew to hate. But putting that aside, I think that some people might think that the political identity itself is something that is organic. And I don't think that that's true, because a lot of the actors that were part of the 1960s had some external influences. And so I would like to bring that to people's attention, the fact that a lot of the hippies at that time were not being led by virtuous people. They were often just running with the first sign of philosophy that they thought was insightful. And we'll be getting to that, I think, in the next slide. So, the romantic view of the 60s, the romantic view of the hippies, it is also an extension of the boomer truth, clinging to this nostalgia factor, which is cultural poison. This is the thing that makes culture stagnant and it cannot grow. I've said a little cynically, maybe too cynically, that this is what jazz experienced in American culture. This is what the big band era suffered from. And obviously, we don't have to argue about the musical merits. I think a lot of that is subjective. We can get a little libertarian when we talk about the musical preferences. But if we want to talk about it as a legacy, a movement within the United States, the fact that it is not Hegelian, the fact that it is not combining other coalitions to survive past the 60s. I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks of the hippies, is they want to stay exclusively in the 60s, which is kind of ironic. I thought the revolution was supposed to be permanent. I thought none of their philosophy could surrender to the status quo, but as we're seeing today, it certainly has. And so Hunter S. Thompson, as I cited earlier, he looks at it through this similar cynical lens. He says the hippies had their heyday. They had the world in the palm of their hands, and then they failed. They were too busy getting high, and they didn't focus on the political goals. But what were people supposed to expect from the hippies? Because what are the principles? These are not people equipped with revisionism. They are a consumer class, really, if we had to define them a certain way. The fact that hippies don't really have anything meaningfully spiritual in a Christian sense, I think a lot of this makes it easy for them to be exploited, a lot of them to be misled by partisan actors. And that's where you get this activist class. It might be futile to separate the fun-loving hippie from the more agitated, progressive version. But I think it's worth saying that these groups tend to not investigate their identity. They don't seem to really say what is the limit of their principles. And that's how they become subverted and not be able to adapt to the culture outside of the 1960s. And so people like that, youth movements like that, tend to not make it. You can look at a lot of youth movements that don't seem to survive. And that is what I'd like to bring to attention to prevent Generation Z from making that mistake. And this actually reminds me of the recent news about Tulsi Gabbard, the Hawaiian representative. Now, I think the proper way to frame this for this presentation's sake is to look at this as an identity crisis. How does the Democratic Party move past people like her, people that probably are more welcome in independent circles? I think because what tends to happen is a lot of people like Tulsi Gabbard seem to figure out this stuff too late. They seem to question identity questions after the fact in this post hoc way. And what happens with that is the fact that the status quo has already been established. And so a lot of these youth movements that are not equipped with fighting against the status quo, they are often on the receiving end of power. And so I'm sympathetic to her. I'm sympathetic, but no, we're good. Sympathetic to her, but I am also, it is very moderate. It is something that we talked about with Jordan Peterson. It's something that we talk about with a lot of American conservatism, the fact that what holds them back is believing in the boomer truth, the fact that they don't want to totally condemn the hippie movement. They actually sympathize a little too muchly because they think that a lot of those principles are theirs. But here's the thing about Tulsi Gabbard, it's a pivot to the middle. And like we said earlier about people who want to reconcile the pre-modern world and the modern world, there is no compromise. And that's just something that I think people are going to have to face at some point. Because when we try to merge those things, we often get a perversion of identity. And we get two different things that aren't meant to be reconciled. There has to be a choice one way or the other. So I think in our next slide. All right. So here's the thing. One of the reasons the hippies get an advantage reputation-wise is because they are often comparing themselves to the future. They look at something like the Woodstock 1970 documentary, and they see that as a pivotal moment. They see it as a touchstone in pop culture. But I would like to argue the fact that Woodstock 1969 is really, substance-wise, no different than Woodstock 99. And why is that? What are the critiques against Woodstock 99? Well, first of all, you had this big hodgepodge of bands that don't really go together. You had an audience, a demographic that would probably not otherwise check out other bands and participate in certain genre mixing that I think leaves a lot of people at a disadvantage, and it kind of distorts music in this very modern way. It kind of creates it like how technology exacerbates the culture, exacerbates a lot of the music trends. But the thing about Woodstock 99 that people often talk about is the fact that it was violent. There were riots. There was all this agitation. People were not satisfied with the conditions. What better way to describe the climate of 1969 and the things that the hippies faced during the 60s? So I think a lot of people, they often don't really look at it through that lens. They often think that this progressive thing is something new. It is something that can be frozen, taken back to a certain era and stay there. But I think what we're finding is there has to be a pre-modern look at the hippies and really investigate why this identity was able to get exacerbated onwards. And so that's kind of the thing with Woodstock 99. A lot of it, there was a recent documentary about it, and it was a hit piece. It was this partisan political thing. But I think one thing that people could learn from that documentary is the fact that a lot of the rose-colored glasses that people look at with the original Woodstock, a lot of that is because of the boomer truth. And a lot of people are not aware of that dynamic. They just see it as, and we're going to get into Theodore Adorno, but it's this framework where we're just running away from the most controversial aspects of culture, but we're going to see that that's not a sustainable platform moving forward. And so in our next slide. And so that's how you get perversions. That's how, last week we talked about how do punk rockers still call themselves punk? How do, even though the music changes, how do certain trends that were unacceptable become acceptable through gatekeepers? Well, it's because the hippies themselves were not the gatekeepers. They gave the power over to their more older counterparts, and they trusted the professors. They trusted media pundits, the pundit class, a lot of partisan activists. They trusted them with that kind of, with this type of leadership that was going to control the culture. But of course, it only became more partisan, and it only got them away from the original merits of the philosophy. Not that the hippie philosophy was much to defend to begin with, but I'm just saying from a political standpoint, this thing didn't even stay true to its own principles. And this was a movement that was supposed to be identified by the youth. They were supposed to set the terms. And did that end up happening? No. What we saw was people older than them telling them what was better for them. And that works within a religious framework. But for these people that wanted to dominate their own space, they ended up getting dominated themselves. And so that's something that Generation Z, I think, would be helpful if they were aware of that dynamic, because those same trends are happening today in political circles. So I think in the next slide, we're going to get into some stale media. I think we're going to get into, okay. So last week we had Anthony Fantano on the screen. We had Watch Mojo. I know that this may seem unrelated, but this is the thing. This is what happens when you don't have gatekeepers in culture. This is what happens when you don't have an appropriate amount of elitism. You have people that are towing an ideological line, and they're not really invested in the culture. They're not invested in the history of a lot of these young people that were trying to step outside of like a superstructure, so to speak. If we're going to use Marxist language, not to defend Marxism, but to help us understand the American dynamic of power structures, the idea that the status quo was something that could be critical against in a fruitful way. But to bring it back to this slide, I want to talk about, this is how you get certain synthetic thought leaders, quote unquote. People like Ayn Rand, a lot of people frame her as a philosopher, but really she's just a sci-fi writer. She is a fantasy novelist, but people are still impressed by her because there is no alternative. They don't see the other path of revisionism. They don't see the other people like Pat Buchanan or Phyllis Schlafly, the people that we can piece together, looking back in retrospect as Zoomers online. But for people at the time, they saw the loudest voice in the room and they thought that that was revolutionary. That's how they fall for revolutionary rhetoric. And then the other example, as said earlier, Theodore Adorno. This is somebody who collaborated in writing the Authoritarian Personalities, I think among other people too. His legacy is all over the place, but in the Authoritarian Personality, talking about how the best way to look at identity is exclusively through getting away from the most controversial aspects. But that's not how identity works. Identity has to exist within a much more complicated way. And so the hippies that want to condemn everything in black and white, it's just like how people condemn the 90s, but not the 60s. It's not that black and white. And so I think in our next slide here, we're going to, and so that's how a lot of Zoomers become confused. A lot of them they trust a lot of people. They trust a lot of pundits. They have a parasocial relationship with the pundit class. And then they themselves become the same people molded by that same strain of thought. And so I'd like people to get their own identity, a more authentic identity that is not wedded to CIA influences, that is not wedded to professor types, media types. I want people to express themselves authentically. And so if we could go to the next slide here, in conclusion, this is what I'm trying to address. You can see it a little bit there, but I'm trying to say that the state of young people is in need of repair. And we're not going to do that by using 60s ideology. We're not going to use that from only being loyal to a 20th century framework. We also would like to have something authentic, something pre-modern. And I think elitism can gatekeep Generation Z from having other people like Generation Alpha might have their hands of power at defining our legacy. And we don't want to see that. We want people to define their legacy honestly and appropriately. So we want to avoid the hippie trajectory in this next slide. Maybe this gives people some hope. The hippies lost their momentum. They got captured. Their saga toes a political line. Their mentors, our professors, journalists, the people that sabotaged their own movement. But I would encourage people to put on their Hegelian socks. And I think that that's going to help us express ourselves in a much more authentic way and learn from the past, learn from the hippies, because they're a youth movement that didn't have a lot of direction. I think if people have spiritual guidance, the appropriate spiritual guidance in a religious sense, have some pre-modern views, and then I think we're going to see ourselves a very worthwhile 21st century that is not filled with hippies, thankfully. Okay, because they mastered the bang and the slang and the mental of people from Compton, Watson, South Central. They're studio gangsters, okay? They're cringe. So that's the thing. We're going to have to step over the hippies and embrace Generation Z's authentic identity. Thank you. All right. We have, there we go. I'm thinking we're back. All right. If we don't have any questions, I'll actually got some battery here. So, yeah. Well, so yeah. Let me see here. Ryan, don't worry about it. Replay gang's got your back. Yes, sir. Zoomer in the class. Speak.
Do you think Hitler would have been a fan of Limp Bizkit?
I think, given his background, I don't think when we talk about the pre-modern world and the modern world, unfortunately, I don't think we can reconcile those two camps. Okay. Groups. And so I think we could speculate Hello? Are we still here?
Is it working? I guess we'll see.
Oh, yeah, it just went on right now.
Welcome back. We will go through the remaining of any questions that we may have. Mutant may be onto something. You bring up Hegel and we'll see. Well, this will be interesting for replay gang. Well, thank you, Edward. Thank you, Mutant. And thank you, bass guitarist. Shout out. Let me see.
He's just gonna go through his questions.
What's going on, Trouble Armstrong? That's a good question. I was trying to figure that out with our very good friends. Glayukan? I'm sorry if that's not correct pronunciation. Learn from the hippies. Yes, I want Generation Z to not be loyal to boomer truth as the hippies did and not fall for false idols as the hippies also seem to do. So that's what I mean. Obviously, the hippies were not exactly a youth movement that is worth defending lifestyle-wise, but we can look at it maybe a bit more conceptually. Let me see if we have any. No worries. All right. Thank you, Vingel. Good to see you here, buddy. All right. I think we are. Yeah, we're good. All right, I think that is. And what is it, Vingel? Yes, you're right, Vingel. You're right. All right. All righty. I think that concludes the presentation. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. And take it easy. One sec. I did. I think we cannot reconcile because Limp Bizkit is part of the modern world, unfortunately. Well, if it was a Zoomer, who was a Zoomer? Would it be like Blade? No, we're still alive. So I think that concludes the presentation. Thank you all for participating, and we'll catch you next time.